First off, I want to thank you for putting together this podcast. It's great to have a place where I can talk about these things without feeling like I'm losing my mind. I never really believed in strange stories, but a few years ago, something happened that changed my mind. It was in Humboldt County, California, a place that's pretty remote and beautiful, but also where a lot of people go missing every year. I live in Nevada, but my cousin, who I'm really close to, lives in California. In 2012, before I headed off to college, we decided to take a road trip through Northern California. My cousin, who I'll call Todd for privacy, is a bit of a thrill seeker. He's always into risky sports and wild adventures. I told him I wanted to keep this trip low-key, and he agreed. We planned to drive up the famous Highway 101, then cut across the state on Route 299, a scenic road that winds through the mountains. Todd was driving an old Nissan at the time. It was so worn out that there was a hole in the passenger side floor, and I had to be careful not to put my foot through it. It was late summer, and the weather was perfect. As we drove further north, the air got cooler, so we rolled down the windows and cranked up the music. The first few nights, we stayed in motels and explored towns like Eureka. Along the way, we met up with two of Todd's friends who joined us for the drive. As we drove, we started sharing stories about odd experiences we'd had. I didn't have much to add. My life had been pretty normal. But one of the girls with us, Catherine, was really into this stuff. She had a few stories of her own, which she called encounters. At first, Todd, his other friend, and I laughed it off. But as Catherine kept talking, it was clear she was serious, and we realized she was getting upset that we didn't believe her. The mood in the car shifted, maybe because it was getting dark. We were on Route 299 in a wooded area when Todd spotted a deep pull-off on the side of the road, so we decided to camp there. I love camping, but that night I was on edge. I thought it was just because of Catherine's creepy stories. They were getting stranger as the night went on. We set up camp, with Todd and I sharing a tent while the other two friends set up hammocks and started a fire. The night was quiet, and nothing unusual happened. The next morning, one of the girls mentioned a waterfall nearby that was a popular hiking spot, so we decided to check it out. We parked near a few other cars, so everything felt normal. I swapped my sneakers for boots, and we all grabbed our gear and headed into the woods. It was a beautiful day, but surprisingly dark under the trees. The trail started off flat, but soon began to climb as we headed toward the waterfall. After a few tight switchbacks, we came out onto a bare spot with a view. We could see mountains nearby, and the mist was rising from the valleys, a sight I love. About half an hour into the hike, we reached a switchback with a clear view of a rugged mountain across from us. It had some bald, rocky spots, and that's where we saw the figure. At first, Todd thought it was a bear and pointed it out, but soon we realized it wasn't a bear, it was a person. The girls backed off the trail, clearly uncomfortable, and I joined them. The figure was wearing a dark cloak, almost like a robe, and was just standing there, staring. I couldn't see his face, but the whole thing felt wrong. Todd stood at the edge of the switchback, barely breathing. I had a horrible feeling that something bad would happen if the guy noticed us. Just then, a family with young kids came down the trail, breaking the tension. Todd stepped aside to let them pass, and when I glanced back, the figure was gone. We waited a few minutes, then agreed to head back to the car. None of us wanted to stick around. We made it back to the car quickly, piled in, and sped down Route 299. There was no way we were camping in those woods that night. On the way back, Catherine reluctantly started talking about something called the Dark Watchers. A few months later, I looked them up and realized she might have been right. The Dark Watchers are said to be beings that watch travelers in the woods, which is what we were that day. According to legend, they're harmless unless you make eye contact with them. I'm not sure what happens then, but people disappear. That's not unusual in Humboldt County, and now I wonder how many of those missing people encountered Dark Watchers. This is the first time I've told anyone about this. Only Todd and the girls know what we saw that day. I guess I could have used it as an icebreaker in college, but I didn't want to be labeled as the weird kid. As scary as it was, it's good to know that this kind of stuff exists. I'm a lot more cautious and aware now. Thanks again for listening and for sharing stories like this. My name is Henry, and I've always loved exploring the world. There's something thrilling about discovering new places, especially those that few people have ever seen. This is how I ended up in the vast and wild outback of Australia. It all started when I was traveling through a remote part of the Northern Territory. The red dirt roads stretched on for miles, with nothing but dry bushes and the occasional kangaroo to keep me company. The sun was beating down on me, making the air thick and heavy. It was the kind of place where you could feel truly alone. I had heard stories from the locals about strange creatures that lived in the outback, cryptids they called them. These were animals that science hadn't officially recognized, but that people swore existed. Most of the time, I brushed these stories off as mere myths or tall tales, but one story in particular stuck with me. It was about a creature they called the Australian raptor. The Australian raptor, as the locals described it, was a giant bird of prey, much larger than any eagle or hawk. They said it had sharp claws, wings that could block out the sun, and eyes that seemed to pierce through the soul. Some claimed it was a descendant of the ancient predatory birds that once ruled the skies, while others believed it was something more mysterious, maybe even supernatural. One evening, as the sun was setting, I decided to set up camp near a rocky outcrop. The view was breathtaking, with the golden light of the sun painting the landscape in shades of orange and red. After pitching my tent and starting a small fire, I settled down to enjoy the quiet of the outback. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I looked around, my heart pounding, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The fire crackled beside me, but it did little to calm my nerves. Then, I saw it. A shadow passed overhead, so large that it blotted out the stars for a moment. I looked up, and there, silhouetted against the night sky, was the Australian raptor. It was enormous, with wings that seemed to stretch forever. Its body was covered in dark, sleek feathers, and its eyes glowed with an eerie light. It circled above me, its sharp beak opening and closing as if it were sizing me up. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The creature was exactly as the locals had described, but seeing it in person was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The raptor swooped down, its massive wings stirring up the dust around me. It landed on a nearby rock, its claws gripping the stone with terrifying strength. The creature let out a piercing screech, the sound echoing through the still night air. I could feel its eyes on me, watching my every move. In that moment, I knew that I was in the presence of something ancient and powerful. The stories were true, and the Australian raptor was real. But as terrifying as it was, there was also something majestic about the creature. It was as if I were looking at a living relic from a time long past. For what felt like hours, the raptor and I stared at each other. I didn't dare move, not wanting to provoke it. Slowly, it tilted its head, as if trying to figure out what I was. Then, with a sudden flap of its wings, it took off into the sky. I stood there in stunned silence, my heart still racing. Had I really seen what I thought I had? Or was it all just a figment of my imagination? But the deep claw marks on the rock where it had perched were proof enough. The Australian raptor was real, and I had been lucky, or unlucky, enough to see it. I didn't sleep much that night, too shaken by the encounter. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining the raptor returning, this time not as a curious observer, but as a predator. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I quickly packed up my camp and continued on my journey. As I drove away from that place, I couldn't help but wonder how many other people had seen the Australian raptor. How many had been too scared to speak of it, fearing they would be laughed at or called crazy. I knew that when I told my story, many would doubt me, but I didn't care. I knew what I had seen, and that was enough. In the days that followed, I tried to learn more about the raptor. I spoke to more locals, asked them about their encounters, and even searched for any old reports or sightings. But information was scarce, as if the creature was a well-kept secret of the outback. Some people were willing to share their stories, while others dismissed me with a knowing smile, as if they had seen it too but didn't want to relive the experience. Eventually, I left the outback and returned to my normal life. I first heard about the Fiskerton Phantom when I was a child, living in a small village nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests. The older folks in the village would often tell tales of strange creatures that roamed the woods, but none was as mysterious as the spotted Fiskerton Phantom. They described it as a creature with the body of a large cat, but with a pattern of spots like no animal they had ever seen. The phantom was said to be elusive, appearing only on misty nights when the moon was hidden behind clouds. As a child, I was both fascinated and frightened by these stories. The idea of a creature lurking in the shadows, unseen but always present, captured my imagination. I would often lie in bed at night, staring out the window at the dark forest, wondering if the phantom was out there, watching. Years passed, and I grew older, but the stories of the Fiskerton Phantom never left my mind. I would occasionally ask the elders about it, but they would always brush off my questions with a knowing smile and a shake of their heads. Just an old tale, they would say, but I could see the hint of unease in their eyes. One autumn evening, as the air grew crisp and the leaves began to turn, I decided to take a walk in the woods. The sun was setting, casting a golden light through the trees, and a thin mist was beginning to rise from the ground. I had walked these paths countless times before, but that evening, the forest felt different. The shadows seemed longer, the air cooler, and there was a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I wandered deeper into the woods, my footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The trees loomed tall and silent around me, their branches intertwining above like a tangled web. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped and listened, but all I could hear was the distant call of an owl and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but then I saw the spots. They were like nothing I had ever seen before, large, irregular shapes, almost like the markings of a leopard, but more chaotic and wild. The creature moved with a fluid grace, its body low to the ground as it slipped between the trees. I watched in awe as the Fiskerton Phantom emerged from the shadows. It was larger than I had imagined, its body sleek and powerful, covered in thick, spotted fur. Its eyes were a piercing yellow, glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, it seemed to study me, as if deciding whether I was a threat or merely a curious onlooker. I held my breath, afraid to move. The phantom was so close now that I could see the muscles rippling beneath its fur and hear the soft padding of its paws on the ground. It was a beautiful and terrifying creature, a living embodiment of the wild and untamed. After what felt like an eternity, the Fiskerton Phantom turned and slipped back into the shadows. I stood there, rooted to the spot, but the evidence was there before me, the soft indentation of its paw prints in the earth, the lingering scent of the forest that clung to the air. I returned to the village that evening, my mind buzzing with the encounter. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, about what I had seen, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. The Fiskerton Phantom was just a story, after all, a myth passed down through generations. But I knew what I had seen, and it had left a mark on me that I couldn't shake. The days passed, and the memory of the phantom began to fade, but I found myself drawn back to the woods again and again. I would take long walks, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature, but it never appeared. As the years went by, I moved away from the village. Perhaps, one day, I will return to the village and walk those forest paths again. I will listen for the soft rustle of leaves, watch for the flicker of movement in the shadows, and maybe, just maybe, I will see the spotted Fiskerton Phantom once more. Until then, I will keep the memory of that encounter close to my heart. The road stretched out before me, long and winding, like a dark ribbon cutting through the Wisconsin countryside. Bray Road wasn't a place I'd ever paid much attention to, just another country lane that connected small towns and sleepy farms. But all of that changed the night I encountered the beast. It was early October, and the air had a bite to it. The trees were shedding their last leaves, and the fields had turned a dull brown. There was a sense of quiet in the air, the kind that only comes when nature is settling in for winter. I was driving home after visiting a friend in the next town over, my headlights piercing the darkness, the road empty except for me. Something large and dark moved just at the edge of my vision near the tree line. I blinked, trying to focus, but whatever it was had vanished. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a deer or a shadow cast by the moon. But something in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. It was the way it moved, too fast, too deliberate. The road was empty, as it usually was at that time of night, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the cold. As I drove further, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was a sensation that settled in my gut, making me uneasy. I turned up the heat in the car, trying to shake off the creeping fear that was slowly building inside me. I kept driving, hoping to reach home soon. But then, as I rounded a bend in the road, I saw it. Standing right in the middle of Bray Road was something I could only describe as unnatural. It was much taller than any man, with a broad, muscular build. Its head was like that of a wolf, with a long snout and pointed ears. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen in my car, staring at this creature that shouldn't exist. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It was too big, too menacing, and there was an intelligence in its gaze. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the fear in my chest was too real. I don't know how long we stared at each other. Time seemed to slow down, and the world around us faded into the background. It was just me and the beast, locked in a silent confrontation on that lonely stretch of road. I couldn't bring myself to move, afraid that any sudden motion might provoke it. The beast didn't move either, just kept staring at me with those unnerving eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. It moved with a speed and grace that was almost impossible for something of its size. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. For a few moments I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a wolf? No, it was too big. A bear? No, bears don't look like that, and they don't move like that either. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. Eventually, I forced myself to drive on, glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting the beast to come charging after me. But the road behind me was empty, and I made it home without further incident. I locked the doors behind me and went straight to bed, though sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. The next morning, I debated telling someone about what I had seen. But what would I say? That I had seen a monster on Bray Road? No one would believe me, and I didn't want to be the subject of ridicule in our small town. So I kept quiet, convincing myself that maybe it had been a trick or just my imagination brought on by the late hour and the isolation of the road. But over the next few weeks, I began to hear whispers. Other people had seen something strange on Bray Road too. They didn't describe it exactly the way I had seen it, but there was a common thread, something large, dark, and fast that seemed to disappear as quickly as it appeared. No one had any proof, no pictures, no tracks, nothing but their own fear and confusion. Some said it was just an animal, a coyote or a wolf perhaps. Others thought it was a prank, kids trying to scare the locals with stories of a monster. But there were those, like me, who knew deep down that this was something more. We didn't talk about it openly, but there was a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement that something was out there, lurking in the shadows of Bray Road. As the sightings continued, the beast became something of a legend in our town. People started driving down Bray Road at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. Some claimed they saw it, others saw nothing at all, but the stories kept spreading. The more people talked, the more the legend grew, but no one ever captured any real evidence. The beast remained elusive, always just out of reach, a shadow on the edge of reality. It was a quiet evening when it happened. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the last bits of daylight were fading into the night. My friend and I were driving back home after a long day of hiking in the woods. The road was empty, surrounded by trees on both sides, and the air felt still, almost too still. As we drove, we noticed something strange up ahead. There was a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, we thought it might be someone who needed help. Maybe their car broke down, but as we got closer, we realized this was no ordinary person. The figure was tall, much taller than any person we'd ever seen. He was wearing a dark suit that seemed a bit too tight, almost like it was holding him together. But what really made our hearts race was his face. He had this unsettling grin, stretched from ear to ear, like he was amused by some secret only he knew. His eyes were large, round, and didn't blink. They followed our car as we passed by, locking onto us like he could see right through to our souls. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I could see my friend gripping the steering wheel tighter. There was something wrong about this man, something unnatural. He didn't move, didn't try to stop us, just stood there, grinning as we drove by. We didn't talk about it at first, too shaken to put what we saw into words. But the image of that man, of Indrid Cold, as we later learned he was called, stayed with us. It haunted our dreams, filled our waking thoughts with unease. We found out later that others had seen him too, always appearing in strange, quiet places, always grinning. From that day on, things were different. It was like a shadow had been cast over us. The world didn't feel as safe as it once did, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Indrid Cold had left a mark on us, a deep, unsettling sense that there were things out there, just beyond our understanding, waiting in the dark. And the worst part? The grin. We could never forget that grin.